For every anime and manga out there, there are hundreds of people reviewing those new chapters, those new episodes, or looking back at the series as a whole. Over the course of my time on the internet, I've seen a lot of good reviews, but many more bad ones. And so today I wanted to look at what distinguishes a good review from a bad one, and go over what I think to be some proper etiquette when making a review. The first point, and one that many new reviewers get stuck on, is distinguishing review from mere summary. When we summarize, we're recounting the events that occurred. So if we were to, for example, summarize Naruto Chapter 1, well, we might say something like this. Social outcast Naruto is manipulated by Sensei Mizuki into stealing a scroll that would get him in trouble. However, another sensei, Iruka Sensei, de-escalates the situation. Naruto uses the technique found within the scroll, defeats Mizuki, and all is well. That's a summary. You're just recapping what happened. So what's the problem with this? Well, look at it this way. What does the viewer get out of a summary that they can't get out of reading the original source material? Well, the answer is nothing. My summary is but a pale imitation of what actually occurs in the manga. There's a lot more detail and nuance that make it a lot more than those few cursory outlines that I just gave you. So when you make a review, ask yourself this. Am I offering the audience something new that isn't in the source material? And if not, there is zero incentive for them to read your review. So simply summarizing is not enough to make a review. So what should you do? What exactly is it that distinguishes a review from a summary? Well, reviews offer a critical lens. They add something to the source material, some kind of critical overview. They evaluate how consistent the ideas are, what it does particularly well relative to other items in the genre. So if you were to do a review of the first chapter of Naruto, what you might do is highlight how it actually follows a similar structure as most first chapters in Weekly Shonen Jump, but the unique ways in which it makes it its own. And you go into enough detail with this so that the audience can get a deeper appreciation for what Naruto's actually doing, something they might have missed in their original reading. This thereby enriches their experience of the source material and adds to it. And in this way, your review is contributing something positive to the discussion about the source material. This is good. This is why people like reviews. But if you're not doing that, then you're wasting their time. Now, it's important to recognize that summary is an essential aspect of a review. You can't assume that your audience remembers everything from the chapter, and so it is prudent to kind of highlight the relevant details that you'll be discussing. And so yes, a good review will include some degree of summary, but it should make up a smaller percentage of the overall review, and it should only be limited to those details necessary for your critical analysis. Now that you've understood the difference between summary and critique, I think it's time we look at what exactly makes a good critique. And there are a few approaches one might take. The first is what I call a kind of top-down approach to review. This is when you have some kind of philosophical idea or literary theme beforehand, and you go to a text and try and find it within the text. So for example, in Attack on Titan, many people talk about how Levi embodies certain principles of stoicism, how time and time again he practices resilience when faced with obstacles, failure, or even tragedy. And that, in a certain sense, does add something to the source material that's not obviously there. You're taking some pre-established philosophical system, and you're identifying how Attack on Titan uses it. However, there is a good and a bad way to do this top-down approach. A bad way would be to do this. To simply find examples of how Levi is a stoic, and then say because Attack on Titan embodies these principles, it is therefore a good manga. As far as I'm concerned, that's a rather shallow analysis. All you've done is taken some pre-existing philosophical system, which you could have easily read up about on Wikipedia in a few minutes, and then cherry-picked examples of how some show fits that pre-established philosophy. The problem is that this doesn't really contribute much more to either discussions around that philosophy, or honestly, the source material itself. Because Stoicism is a very old philosophical doctrine. It's been tested and tried time and time again. We know what obstacles it struggles to deal with. We know where it thrives against other ethical systems. And so the discussion around Stoicism is pretty rich. So obviously it can be quite intimidating to try and add to that. I mean, how would you? Although it might be discouraging, there are certainly ways to do so. Well, the way you would do it is this. You would find examples where it's not obvious that Levi is perfectly adhering to the principles of Stoicism. And then you'd ask the question, what principle is he challenging here? If he's normally a Stoic, why isn't he acting Stoic here? What's the difference? Where does the principles of Stoicism fail Levi in this specific scene? Because obviously, if he's otherwise always Stoic, and there's examples of him not being Stoic, there must be a reason for it. And by probing these specific instances, you can add a whole lot more nuance to your discussions of these philosophical ideas. And that's what's important. That's when you get a really nice engagement between the philosophical ideas you bring to a text and the text itself. Now it feels like you're marrying a philosophical system to a text and using it to bring the best out of both worlds. That's a good review, and that's the good etiquette we should be practicing when we review. Now, there is still one other way you can approach a text. You don't necessarily have to bring ideas to the text to get the most out of it. There's also what I like to call the bottom-up approach. So a bottom-up review starts with ideas that are very evidently in the text. You're not bringing some pre-established system to the text and interpreting it that way. What you're doing is you're trying to develop some idea, some theme from the ideas that are in the text itself. So an example of this would be, for instance, to read Goodnight Pun Pun and focus on the very obvious ideas of alienation present in, say, the portrayal of Pun Pun as a bird or his kind of social awkwardness. You take those ideas and you trace them throughout the manga. You try to interpret different scenes in terms of his motivation of beating this alienation. And you talk about how he's successful in some places and why he isn't in others. You try to interpret later events in terms of earlier motivations. You try to interpret visual metaphors and tie those back to certain key principles for characters. Obviously, I'm speaking quite vague right now, but the idea is you want to work with ideas that are quite evidently present in the text and might not necessarily fit together into a perfect system, but work to tell a story in conjunction with one another. And so sure, you don't get to kind of hand wave these kind of big philosophical names like you might when you bring a system into the text. However, if you just work from the ideas present within it, you normally come up with a much more meaningful interpretation that can more concretely impact how we review the text. So why do I think this approach to reviewing is better than the kind of top-down? And it's a practical point. I think that if you come to a text with a philosophical system, you're much more likely to over-explain events in terms of that system for the sake of some kind of consistency, when that consistency might not really be in the text. Like I said with Levi and Stoicism, it's not obvious to me that Levi is always perfectly stoic, and you have to do a lot of extra explaining to try and make that be the case. And so, in many cases like this, you just often end up with a kind of ugly stamping of somebody who wants an idea to work, but it's not obvious that it does work. And a big part of a successful review is one in which it's obvious to the audience that the ideas the reviewer is bringing up are in the text. You'll see this a lot with people who try to mention like Nietzsche. They'll try and find like the eternal recurrence is right here, obviously in the text. You just need to really work to interpret it as such. Or, Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. It's so obviously in this text, guys. Please trust me, it's here. To me, that top-down approach really often results in people just wanting to show that they know a lot of philosophical systems, and it comes at the cost of a system not perfectly overlapping with a text. Now, I don't think every system needs to overlap perfectly with the text to make a successful review. It really varies case by case because every reviewer is going to be slightly different. However, by and large, I think that if you just have a system that you want to import to a series, sometimes it's obvious that that's what's going on, and it doesn't really enrich the experience of the original text, and that's why I'm hesitant to recommend that. However, if you work with ideas already within the text, if you look at certain visual motifs and you're able to interpret that consistently from the front to the back, well, there's a lot of value there, and it's quite obvious that it fits with the text because you got the ideas from within it. If you can present that coherently, then you've got arguably one of the best reviews one could. And so that's kind of my guide to what makes a good review. Again, the 3 points that I really discussed here today was 1, don't get stuck in analysis paralysis. And by that I mean, don't simply over-summarize the text and leave it at that. You need to give the viewer something that they can't just get from the source material. Then, once you actually get into the habit of reviewing, there are 2 approaches one might take. A kind of top-down approach in which you bring different philosophical ideas and literary themes to the text, and then interpret the text accordingly. And of course, the most optimal way to do this is to find instances where characters challenge the systems you're bringing to the text, and that's where you kind of get nuance in the discussion. Or there's the other approach of the bottom-up, in which you try and find ideas very obviously within the text, trace them throughout the text, use those ideas to interpret later events, etc., etc. I hope this video helped you in some capacity. If you thought it did, don't forget to give it a like. And until next time, don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe. Peace and love, baby.